They didn't come. That's the sentence I have carried for 5 years like a stone in a coat pocket, heavy in a way you stop noticing only because the weight becomes part of how you move. My graduation, May 12th, 2019. 4 years of 3 a.m. study sessions, a full merit scholarship that covered every dollar of tuition, and a master's degree in financial economics from a university that cost my parents absolutely nothing, because I had spent 7 years making sure it wouldn't. The 2 people who were supposed to be sitting in the 3rd row center were 4 states away in a Savannah backyard watching my cousin Marcus blow out 23 candles on a cake shaped like a football field. They spent over $4,000 on that party. The florist, the DJ, the catering, the decorations my mother had spent 2 weeks choosing. They could not find $400 for a round-trip flight to watch me walk across a stage I had earned in a way that was going to change the course of everything that came after. And what I did next, they never saw coming. Before I continue, subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. My name doesn't matter as much as what I built. I was 31 years old at the time this story reached its conclusion, and by that point I had spent nearly a decade constructing something quietly and without asking for approval. I was a financial compliance analyst for a mid-size firm in Chicago, the kind of work that lives in the negative spaces of contracts, in the places where language softens around things it doesn't want to say directly. I was good at finding what wasn't written. I had been promoted twice in 3 years. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city that still surprised me some mornings. The skyline rising gray and silver and precise through the glass. I paid my bills 2 weeks before they were due. I had savings that were real and growing. And I had understood for a long time that other people's pride was a currency I could not spend. I was the kind of daughter who sent flowers on Mother's Day and called on birthdays and remembered my father's promotion anniversary because no one else thought to mark it. I wasn't performing love. I had stopped believing that earned love was possible somewhere around the age of 14, when the pattern first made itself clear enough to name. I was trying to be the version of myself I could look at in the mirror without flinching. My family, my parents especially, had a way of making me feel like I was standing just outside the edge of every photograph they took. Not invisible, just not included in the frame. And I had spent a long time telling myself I was built for distance, that I could generate my own warmth, that the cold room was just a preference they had rather than a verdict. Marcus was 3 years younger than me. He was funny in the specific way people call charming when they don't want to say undisciplined. He borrowed money without asking and returned it when he remembered, which wasn't often. He left 2 colleges and started a 3rd, and then stopped mentioning school entirely. He had a new plan every 6 months, a food truck, a clothing line, a music project that never got past the recording stage. And the family received each new plan like a dispatch from somewhere important. My mother would forward me his Instagram posts the way some parents forward honor roll certificates. "Look what Marcus is doing," she would write. "He's really finding his path." I would read those texts from my desk at a firm where I had found my path years ago, and I wouldn't respond until enough time had passed that I could say something that didn't carry the weight of what I was actually feeling. The pattern existed long before the graduation. It started in high school when they skipped my Honor Society induction to take Marcus to a theme park because he had had a rough month and needed something good. It happened at my college acceptance dinner that was never scheduled because they were helping Marcus move into an apartment across town, which took all day and somehow also the evening. It showed up in the small moments. The birthday calls that were 5 minutes long because Marcus needed the phone, the holiday visits rearranged around his schedule, the family conversations that circled back to whatever was happening in Marcus's life, the way water circles a drain. I excused it. I told myself they were stretched thin. I told myself that Marcus needed them in a way I had made myself not need anyone. and I had allowed that to become justification for them giving me less and less until giving me nothing felt like a logical conclusion rather than a deliberate choice. The graduation was the fullest expression of everything that came before it. I sent the date 6 months in advance. I included hotel options at 3 price points. I walked them through the logistics the way I would walk a client through a compliance review, methodically, patiently, with the implicit understanding that we were working toward the same goal. My mother said they were coming. My father said they were coming. 3 weeks before the ceremony, my mother mentioned that Marcus's birthday fell on the same weekend. I told her I knew that. She said they would figure it out. They figured it out by choosing him. I found out the morning of my graduation, not a phone call, a text message at 7:42 in the morning. "We are so sorry, baby. Marcus really needed us this year. We'll celebrate when you come home." I read it once. I read it again. I set the phone face down on the bathroom counter and finished getting dressed in a room where the only sound was the radiator ticking against the morning cold. I put on my graduation gown alone in front of the bathroom mirror. The light in that apartment caught things at a particular angle in the early morning that made everything look sharper than it was, and I stood there in that sharpened light and made a decision. I was done pretending the seat would ever be filled. I walked to the ceremony. I sat with strangers whose families were visible in the stands, cameras and signs and voices filling the space above us. I walked across that stage and heard a single cheer from somewhere toward the back that turned out to be my roommate, who had stayed when she had other options, who had been sitting in those bleachers because she knew what the day meant even if the people who should have known couldn't be bothered to arrive. A stranger with a good camera took my photo in front of the building afterward, and I thanked her and smiled and meant it. Because in that moment, I made a second decision. I was not going to hand the memory of that day over to people who weren't there to shape it. 3 weeks later, I went home for the summer. There was a framed photograph of Marcus's birthday party on my parents' mantle. 23 of his friends in someone's backyard, balloons, the enormous cake. My mother had arranged it at a portrait studio. No one said anything about a graduation. I sat across from that mantle at dinner, and I ate the food, and I answered questions about my plans, and I drove home at the end of the night and sat in my parents' driveway for 11 minutes with the engine off and the windows starting to fog, staring at nothing, and I made my third decision. I was done organizing my emotional architecture around a relationship that operated on a one-way ledger. Over the next 5 years, I did not end things. I want to be precise about that. I did not write a letter or arrange a confrontation or announce any change in policy. I simply stopped being available in the ways I had trained them to expect. I stopped flying home for every holiday. When the financial requests came, and they came with the regularity of a subscription, I began saying no, not with explanations, just no. I watched how the warmth in my mother's voice calibrated itself to the temperature of what I was offering. It was an education I had already paid a significant price for, and I was at last beginning to collect on it. Then Marcus died. January of 2024. A car accident on a Thursday afternoon. He was 26 years old and he was gone before the paramedics reached the scene. There is no part of that sentence I say lightly. Whatever I had felt about Marcus, and I had felt many things, some of them complicated in ways I hadn't finished working through, none of it belonged at the threshold of the grief his parents were now standing inside. He was someone's child. He had been my blood. I grieved the way I grieve most things, alone, in measured portions, at the kitchen window in the early morning before the workday started, in a stillness that asked nothing of anyone. My mother called me 4 days after the accident, not to ask how I was, not to tell me how she was, to ask if I would deliver a eulogy. The family felt it would mean the most coming from me, she said, because I was educated and I spoke well and I had known Marcus his whole life. She said this with a particular ease, the ease of someone requesting something from a place of assumed entitlement, someone who has never had to calculate the cost of asking. She said it the way you ask someone to bring a side dish. I was standing in my kitchen in Chicago, one hand flat on the counter, watching the gray surface of the lake through the window. And I held the phone away from my face for a moment and looked at the ceiling, and then I told her I would think about it and call her back. Drop the word rise in the comments right now. I read every single one. I did not call her back that day or the next. I sat with the request for 3 days and let it settle into its actual shape. The question was never whether I would attend. Of course I would attend. The question was whether I was going to give them my voice, whether I was going to stand in front of that church full of people and offer my words in service of a story that had been written around my absence for 20 years. I did what I do when I need to see something clearly. I opened my laptop. I pulled my financial records. What I found when I laid the numbers side by side was not surprising in its individual pieces, only in what they added up to when I finally looked at them all at once. The $380 in February 2018 that my mother said was for car insurance, a transfer that corresponded exactly with the week Marcus's birthday party deposits were due. The $1,200 in December 2020 for what was described as a utility emergency, a transfer that matched precisely the month Marcus needed first and last month's rent on an apartment he vacated 6 months later, the $800 in April the following year, the $450 that was labeled a medical bill. Each of these had felt small enough in the moment to absorb without incident. Laid against each other, printed, placed in sequence, they produced a number I was not prepared to see. Over 7 years, I had transferred $19,240 into my family's accounts in ways that had no documentation, no agreement, no plan for return. Not $1 had come back. Not $1 had ever been named out loud for what it was. I sat with that number in the quiet of my apartment for a long time. The city was doing what the city does at night, distant and indifferent and lit from below. And I sat at my desk in the low light and I looked at the number and I let it mean what it meant. That night, Aunt Dolores called. Dolores was my father's older sister, 71 years old, a woman who had spent decades at the periphery of family events in a way I had always read as detachment, but now understood was something far more deliberate, witness. She had never positioned herself at the center of anything. She had simply remained present at the edges, watching, and she was the kind of woman who believed that the truth deserved to be documented even when no one was ready to receive it. She called at 9:44 that evening and said she had heard my mother had asked me to speak. She said she thought there were some things I should see before I made any decision. 3 days later, she was at my kitchen table with a manila envelope that had been sitting in the drawer of her writing desk for 11 years. Inside it were photographs, a handwritten copy of my grandmother's final letter, a birthday card I had sent Marcus when I was 17 that he had never once acknowledged, and 2 email chains she had printed and kept. The emails were from 2018, a conversation between my mother and her sister Patricia. In the thread, my mother referenced my graduation directly. The date, the university, the hotel information I had sent her months before. She had known. She had it all documented. And in one email, one that I read and then set down on the table in front of me and left untouched for a full minute, she wrote that she had decided to be present for Marcus's birthday because Marcus needed the support, and that, as for me, I was going to be fine regardless. Going to be fine regardless. I put both hands flat on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. Aunt Dolores watched me read and did not say anything to fill the space, which is a gift most people do not know how to give. When I finally set the papers down, she asked very quietly, "You want it quiet or you want it true?" I looked at her. I said, "I want it accurate." She nodded the way someone nods when an answer confirms something they have been holding for a long time. The funeral was on a Friday in Savannah. I flew down Thursday evening and checked into a hotel near the church. I did not stay at my parents' house. I told my mother the hotel was a logistical choice, and she accepted that without examination. which told me what I needed to know about how much she was actually paying attention. Thursday night, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed with my notes in my lap and the heater running low against the wall. The room had that particular hotel silence, a stillness that belongs to no one, that holds no history. I went through what I had written, not a performance, not a prosecution, something more precise than either, a document, an account of something real, offered without theater and without the softening that had always been expected of me. I slept better than I expected to. In the morning, I pressed my dress and sat in the chair by the window for a long time, watching the light move through the curtains in pale, slow increments. I thought about the morning of my graduation, the bathroom mirror, the gown in the cold, sharp light, the decision I had made standing alone in that apartment. I thought about how many of the decisions I had made since that morning had been quietly building toward a version of myself who could walk into a room like the one I was about to enter and remain entirely centered inside herself. The church was full, that specific fullness of a Southern funeral, the community arriving like a closing parenthesis around everything the family can't say out loud. My mother sat in the front row in black, composed with the effort of someone managing an audience. My father beside her. Aunts, cousins, neighbors, church members, the friends Marcus had made across his many addresses and his many new starts. The room smelled like stargazer lilies and old wood, and something sweet underneath everything that I couldn't name. Afternoon light came through the high windows at angles that turned everything into shadow and contrast, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they were painted deliberately. I was third on the program. The first speaker was a childhood friend who gave the room permission to laugh with a story that was mostly true and entirely kind. The second was a minister whose language moved like water, always arriving somewhere warmer than where it began. And then my name was called, and I walked to the front, and I set my papers on the podium, and I looked out at the room. My mother was watching me the way you watch a film you believe you have already seen. She thought she knew the ending. She thought I was going to give them Marcus the way they wanted to remember him, uncomplicated, beloved, his absence made beautiful by someone else's words. She thought I was going to perform the version of the family that looks smooth and whole from a distance. I understood why she thought that. I had been doing exactly that for 20 years. I spoke for 11 minutes. I said Marcus was a person who lived entirely in the present tense, who had a particular brightness that did not survive contact with consequence, and that there was something both genuine and costly about a life organized that way. I said our family had a pattern of rallying loudly around the people who expressed their need loudly, while quietly stepping away from the ones who had learned to need silently. I said I had loved Marcus the way you love someone whose path you can see further down than they can, knowing the distance between where he was and where he needed to be was not a gap the people around him were prepared to help him close. I said I had also spent 20 years being described as the daughter who was going to be fine regardless, and that when someone says that about you long enough, you eventually have to decide whether it was an observation or a decision they made for you without your knowledge. I set my papers on the ledge of the podium. I said, I hope this family learns to look in more directions before the next loss has to do the teaching for us. The silence in that church had a specific texture, not shocked, not angry. Something more like recognition. The sound a room makes when it hears something it already understood but had not been asked to name. My mother's face did not crumble. I want to be precise about this because the precision matters. It did not twist or perform. It emptied. The composure drained out of it like water from a glass. Someone tips slowly, and for one long moment she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had made a series of deliberate choices and was now watching them named quietly in public, without anger and without cruelty, and without any of the protective theater she had counted on. There was nothing in her preparation for what accuracy sounds like when it arrives without apology. I walked back to my seat, Aunt Dolores, 2 rows behind me, reached forward and pressed one hand briefly to my shoulder. It lasted 2 seconds. It was enough. The reception was at my parents' house. I stayed 45 minutes. My cousin Tamara found me near the back porch and told me what I said was brave. My father refilled his glass twice without speaking to me. My Aunt Patricia watched me from across the room with the careful, measuring expression of someone privately doing math. My mother hugged me at the door when I left and held on slightly longer than the moment required. I let her. There was grief in that hug that was real, not manufactured, not strategic. I was not so far past my own compassion that I couldn't recognize real grief when it arrived, but I also knew that a long embrace is not an acknowledgement. It is the body reaching for language the mouth hasn't organized yet. I drove to the hotel. I ordered dinner from a place nearby and ate it at the desk by the window with the curtains open, on a street that was dark and quiet and entirely unbothered by any of it. The ripples in the weeks that followed were quiet but real. My cousin Tamara posted something on the family Facebook group, 40-some members, church friends, distant relatives, old neighbors. She didn't quote me directly. She wrote about spending her whole life being the cousin who was going to be fine regardless and asked if anyone else recognized that feeling. The comment thread ran 4 days. Several people wrote things that made it clear they had lived some version of the same story in their own families. My Aunt Patricia, one of the 2 parties to those 2018 emails, posted nothing, reacted to nothing, and the silence carried its own specific weight. My mother called 4 times in the 2 weeks after the funeral. The first 3 calls were practical. Thank you notes, flower arrangements, Marcus's belongings. The 4th call was different. She started to say something about the service and stopped herself. She said, I sounded good. I said I was. A pause came, the kind that holds something unfinished, and then she said she missed me. I said I knew. We hung up a few minutes later, and I sat with the quiet of that call for a while. It was not resolution, but it was something honest, which is its own rare thing. I have not addressed the $19,000 with my parents directly. I don't yet know if I will. What I have done is restructure my finances to reflect the relationships that actually exist in my life, rather than the ones I spent decades trying to build through proximity and generosity. I stopped moving money in directions that did not return anything, not from anger, from arithmetic. The budget finally matched the reality. I started therapy in February of 2024, not because the funeral had undone me, it had not, but I had been carrying a specific weight for so long that I had stopped being able to tell where the weight ended and I began. My therapist has a print of Lake Michigan above her desk, and she asked me in our very first session to describe a moment when I felt most like myself. I sat with the question for nearly a minute. Then I said, the morning of my graduation, alone in my apartment, putting on my gown in front of the bathroom mirror, the light coming in cold and sharp and entirely mine. She asked what that felt like. I said it felt like something I had built that no one could take credit for. She said, let's talk more about that. And over several months, I began to understand that the aloneness of that morning was not only a wound. Something in it was entirely mine in a way that a crowded ceremony with 2 distracted parents in the 3rd row might not have been. I don't say that to make the abandonment smaller than it was. I say it because the mind is capable of holding more than one truth simultaneously, and learning to stand inside that, to carry the loss and the ownership of it in the same hands, was something I had never given myself permission to do before. 6 months after the funeral, my life looked like this. A new project at work that extended my role into contract negotiations, something I had been building toward for 2 years. A trip to Portugal booked for October. My first real vacation in 4 years, planned entirely around my own schedule. Monthly dinners with Aunt Dolores, alternating between Chicago and a phone call. Always an hour that feels like clean air in a room that had been closed too long. A therapist who is helping me understand that being the capable one is not a permanent identity. It is a role that gets assigned early because it's convenient for everyone else, and you are allowed, at any point, at any age, to set it down without explanation. My parents are still my parents. That relationship has not ended, but it has been clarified, the way you clarify a contract when the original language was too vague to enforce. I know what I am able to give. I know what I am no longer willing to absorb. And that clarity lives inside me not as bitterness, but as something closer to architecture, the kind of internal structure that lets you stand upright in a room without needing the walls to hold you. They asked me to speak at his funeral because they believed I would give them something they could use, something comfortable, something that would hold the shape of the family story they had been maintaining for years, polished and intact, and free of anything real. What I gave them instead was something accurate, and I have learned that accuracy, offered without cruelty, without performance, without the softening that destroys it, is a form of love that most people are not prepared to receive, but it lasts. It holds its shape. It does not require you to disappear inside it to make it work. If this touched something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.